Certain enigmas resemble a thorn embedded deep within the flesh. The ache is undeniable, yet the puncture remains invisible to the eye. Such was the nature of Miss Eleanor Voss's vanishing, an event devoid of violence, outcry or parting words. In its wake, there was only an unoccupied railway seat and a heavy lingering silence. The setting was England. Autumn of 1934. Thick moorland fog descended like a shroud each day, dulling the landscape into a monochromatic grey. Beneath a leaden sky, skeletal trees stood motionless, their fallen leaves a testament to a world that had ceased its vigil for winter. It is during such seasons, when a biting chill permeates both the architecture and the human spirit, that the most peculiar events unfold. At 33, Miss Eleanor Voss was the quintessential governess, solitary, yet possessing sterling credentials and a refined, steadfast dignity born from a life of self-sacrifice. Her correspondence with the Ravenswood family confirmed her departure on the 4:15 p.m. service from London Victoria, destined for Dunmoor. At the station, the family's driver stood ready as the locomotive pulled in, and the carriage doors swung wide, but Eleanor Voss never stepped onto the platform. All that was recovered was her reservation slip for seat 7C, meticulously folded, and an unexpected child's sketch. The drawing, a primitive yet delicate depiction of a home flanked by a towering tree and two figures joined by their hands, seemed impossible, for Miss Voss had yet to set foot in the Ravenswood household. The question remained, what child had rendered this image? And by what means did it find its way into the missing woman's possession? England in the autumn of 1934. The fog rolled in daily from the moor like a heavy curtain, plunging the world into a pale grey. The trees had lost their leaves, and their branches stood bare against the leaden sky, as if they themselves had stopped waiting for winter. On such days, when the cold not only crept through the cracks in the windows, but also seeped into people's hearts, the strangest things happen. Miss Eleanor Voss was a governess, 33 years old, without family, with impeccable letters of recommendation, and the quiet, unwavering dignity of a woman who had learned to subordinate her own desires to the well-being of others. She had taken the 4:15 p.m. train from London Victoria to Dunmoor, so it said in her letter to the Ravenswood family. The family's coachman was waiting at the small station. The train arrived. The doors opened. Eleanor Voss did not resign. What remained was her reservation ticket, carefully folded under seat 7C, and a child's drawing tucked inside. A house with a large tree in front and two small figures holding hands. The drawing was in the clumsy, delicate hand of a small child, but Miss Voss had never met the Ravenswood children. Whose hand had drawn this picture, and how had it gotten into her bag? Hercule Poirot, the Belgian detective with the immaculate moustache and even more immaculate mind, happened to be nearby. He had planned a quiet autumn in his London apartment, herbal tea, his beloved game of solitaire, and perhaps a good book. Fate, as always, had other plans. This novel tells the story of those days when Poirot penetrated the grey mists of Ravenswood Manor and discovered that the most dangerous secret was not a woman's disappearance, but what she knew before she disappeared. The empty seat. The train to Dunmoor was an old, creaking steel worm, winding its way through the English countryside like an animal unsure of its way. Hercule Poirot sat in the first-class compartment, watching the passing scenery with an expression of mild disapproval. Fields, trees, more fields, even more trees. He took out his small notebook and began to study the symmetrical patterns of the hedgerows. The order of nature, he thought, was always a matter of perspective. His destination wasn't Dunmoor. He was going to visit an old friend, a doctor named Dr. Lessing, whose country house was 3 stops further on. But fate, or perhaps the little grey cells that were always more vigilant than their owner, had other plans. It was the woman in the blue travelling coat who first caught his attention. She was sitting 2 compartments away, and Poirot had observed her boarding in London, well dressed but nervous. She had taken off and put on her beige, freshly ironed gloves 3 times as the train left the station. Her eyes flickered to the window, then to the door, then back again, the eyes of a woman waiting, or perhaps afraid. Dunmoor was in the usual autumnal chaos of a small train station, coughing suitcases, shouting porters, the acrid smell of coal and wet dog. Poirot watched the passengers disembark. The woman in the blue coat was not among them. He asked the conductor. The conductor, a plump man with a bright red face and a moustache that couldn't hold a candle to Poirot's, scratched himself under his cap. The lady in compartment 7C? Strange, monsieur. She showed me her ticket, Dunmoor, first class. But when I checked again just before the station, the seat was empty. I initially thought she'd gone to the toilet, but then... He shrugged. She was simply gone. And your luggage? Also gone, but under the seat I found this. The conductor handed Poirot the folded ticket and the drawing. Poirot studied the picture for a long time. A house, a tree, 2 figures. Simple, almost primitive in its execution, but drawn with a peculiar care. Every line deliberate, as if the artist had wanted to capture something important. On the back, in childlike handwriting, were 3 words. Don't come, please. Do you know the lady's name? Asked Poirot. Miss Voss, I think. Eleanor Voss. The Ravenswood family driver was waiting for her. Poirot carefully folded the drawing and put it in his breast pocket. Then, with a small, thoughtful smile, he turned to the conductor. I believe my friend Dr. Lessing will have to wait a little longer for my visit. The driver of the Ravenswoods was a tall, taciturn man named Hodges. He was still standing on the platform, turning his cap in his hands, with the expression of a man unsure whether to stay or go. Poirot introduced himself without mentioning his famous name, initially only as a traveller who had happened to notice the strange situation. Hodges was not very talkative. Yes, he had been expecting Miss Voss. No, he didn't know her personally. Lady Ravenswood had given him the task. He was to fetch her and bring her to the manor. That was all he knew, or perhaps he didn't want to know. But then, while Poirot casually inquired about the house, its location, its history, its inhabitants, Hodges said something that made Poirot pause. The manor has seen better days since Sir Edmund's death. Well, you know, the children are restless, especially the boy. The young. Master Thomas, 8 years old. He hasn't slept in his room for weeks. Won't sleep near the window. Says he sees something outside at night. Hodges lowered her voice, even though no one was around. Of course, it's nonsense, but Lady Ravenswood is worried. Poirot said nothing, but behind his calm eyes the little grey cells were working quietly, precisely, tirelessly. He decided to accept the ride to Ravenswood Manor. The property lay 4 miles outside the village, at the end of a long elm-lined driveway. In summer it might have looked idyllic. On this autumn afternoon, with the mist swallowing the treetops and the gravel crunching under the wheels like broken glass, it felt oppressive. The house itself was a Victorian structure of dark limestone, with tall windows that gazed down at the driveway like weary eyes. No one was waiting for them at the door. Only after the second knock did a butler open it. A man with a face like a mask, grey and expressionless. His name was Croft. He bowed with professional coolness and led Poirot into an entrance hall where a chandelier with half-burned candles hung from the ceiling. Lady Ravenswood is expecting Miss Voss, said Croft. His voice was flat, monotonous. The voice of a man who had grown accustomed to having no opinion. Miss Voss won't be coming, said Poirot calmly. I'm afraid there's a problem. For a moment, just a single, tiny moment, something twitched in Croft's face. Not horror, not surprise, more like confirmation. As if deep down he had known that this day would come. Poirot noticed it. He noticed everything. The house with the locked doors. Ravenswood Manor had 22 rooms. At least 4 of them were locked. This was the first fact Hercule Poirot registered, even before he had met Lady Ravenswood in person. He registered it as he registered everything, casually, without looking, with the keen attention of a man who missed nothing. The second factor was the temperature. Despite the large fireplace in the reception room, the house was strangely cold. Not the physical cold of the poorly heated old building, but a different kind of cold. The coldness of things that had remained unspoken. Lady Catherine Ravenswood received him in the first drawing-room. She was a woman in her early 40s, with the backbone of a woman who had learned not to cry, at least not in front of others. Her black dress was impeccable. Her hair was impeccable. Only her hands betrayed her, white knuckles, fingers tightly intertwined. Monsieur Poirot. Her voice was cool, controlled. Croft told me who you are. I know your reputation, of course. But I don't understand what brought you to my house." "The absence of a woman," Poirot said simply. He told her briefly what had happened: the empty compartment, the abandoned ticket, the child's drawing. Lady Ravenswood listened without interruption, and her expression didn't change, but her hands clenched more tightly. "A strange story," she finally said. "Yes, my lady. May I ask how you met Miss Voss? Which agency recommended her?" A brief pause, barely noticeable, but to Poirot clear as a gong strike. "By personal recommendation." "By whom?" Another pause. "From an old friend, Lady Ashbury in Somerset." Poirot nodded and noted the name in his mind. Lady Ashbury, he would inquire. "And the children, may I meet them?" For the first time, something changed in Lady Ravenswood's posture, a slight tension in her shoulders. "The children are in class. I would prefer if—" "Of course," said Poirot gently. "There's no rush. I'll look elsewhere first, if you don't mind." He wandered through the house with Lady Ravenswood's somewhat reluctant blessing. Croft accompanied him, and 3 paces behind, silent as a shadow. Poirot let him be. He spoke little, but he saw much. In the first-floor corridor he noticed the 4 locked doors. He stopped in front of the third, a heavy oak door with an ornate brass knob, and gently placed his hand on the wood. Cold. "This room is not in use," said Croft from behind him. "Since when?" "Since Sir Edmund's death 2 years ago." "I understand." Poirot turned away. But the next moment he stopped again, this time in front of a small picture on the wall, a watercolour study, a house with a tree and 2 small figures, almost identical to the child's drawing in his pocket. He turned to Croft. The butler looked straight ahead, into the distance with an expression of perfect neutrality. "A lovely picture," said Poirot casually. "Who painted it?" "I don't know, monsieur," he lied. Yet Poirot knew it with the certainty with which he knew everything, not from evidence, but from the subtle change in breathing rhythm, the minimal shift in body weight. Croft lied. At dinner, to which Poirot had been invited as a guest since it was now too late to continue his journey, he sat opposite Lady Ravenswood. Between them lay 2 empty place settings, one for the expected governess, one for someone whose name was not mentioned. Poirot did not ask, not yet. The soup was excellent, the wine was mediocre, the silence was enlightening. After dinner, when Lady Ravenswood had retired with a weary nod, Poirot remained alone in the drawing-room. He took out the child's drawing and examined it under the lamplight. "Don't come, please." Who had drawn this picture, and how had it come into Miss Voss's possession? Was she the recipient or the sender? Had she deliberately left the drawing behind as a message for someone who had come looking for her? Or was it by chance? Hercule Poirot did not believe in coincidence. He heard footsteps. Soft, hesitant footsteps. He didn't turn around. "You may enter if you wish," he said calmly. A small boy stepped out of the shadows of the corridor. 8 years old, dark hair, large brown eyes that seemed far too awake for this hour. He was wearing his pyjamas and had a worn teddy bear tucked under his arm. "You're here because of Miss Voss," said the boy. "No question, a statement of fact." "Yes," said Poirot. "And you are Master Thomas." The child nodded. Then it said something that struck Poirot right in the heart. "I gave her the drawing so she wouldn't come. But she got on the train anyway." What Thomas knew, children are underestimated. This was one of the few weaknesses Hercule Poirot observed in humanity as a whole, and one that had never personally affected him. Children lied less than adults, not because they were more virtuous, but because they had not yet fully mastered the mechanisms of social deception. Thomas Ravenswood was 8 years old, and at that moment he was the most important person in all of England. Poirot asked him to sit down. The boy obeyed with the seriousness of a minor minister attending a state meeting. He held his bear tightly in his arms and looked at Poirot with those frighteningly alert eyes. "Tell me everything," said Poirot simply. "From the beginning," Thomas began. 3 weeks ago he had overheard a conversation. He hadn't overheard intentionally, nor was he emphasized with the moral conviction that children possess for such distinctions. He had gone downstairs to fetch water, and the door to his mother's study was ajar. His mother was talking to someone on the phone. Her voice sounded different than usual, not the voice she used for him and his sister Cecily, soft and a little tired. This voice was tense, whispering, urgent. "She can't come," she had said. "Not now. You don't understand? Once she's here, then—" A pause. "No, it's too late to cancel. She knows too much." Thomas had forgotten the water and had quietly crept up the stairs. In the following days he had observed. He was a good observer, he explained to Poirot with a certain quiet modesty. He noticed that Croft the butler had red eyes that evening. He noticed that his sister Cecily, of our normally 7 years old and full of energy, was sitting alone in the library more and more often, looking at old photograph albums. He noticed that 3 letters arrived, all addressed to Lady Ravenswood, all bearing the same unfamiliar stamp, a small red seal in the shape of a bird. Then, a week ago, he saw something. At night, around 2 in the morning, he looked out of his window. He hadn't been sleeping well lately, so he preferred to sleep on the sofa in the playroom, further away from the window, but that evening he had gone to the window anyway, and he had seen a figure in the garden, a woman wearing a dark cloak, who went to the patio door and knocked. A short time later, Croft appeared. The two had spoken quietly, he couldn't hear anything. Then the woman disappeared back into the darkness. "Did you recognize the woman?" asked Poirot. "No, but I briefly saw her face in the moonlight." Thomas hesitated. "She was crying." Poirot was silent for a moment. Then he asked, "And the drawing? How did Miss Voss get the drawing?" Thomas shrank a little. "I wrote to her, a letter. Mum had given me her address in London because I was supposed to write her a welcome letter. Instead, I told her not to come. I included the drawing so she would understand what I meant." "What did the drawing mean?" "The house. Us. It's not a good place, monsieur." The boy's voice was firm but very quiet. "Since Papa died, strange things have been happening, and Mamma is scared. I know she's scared, even if she doesn't show it, but I know her." Poirot nodded slowly. "You warned Miss Voss because you didn't want anything to happen to her?" "Yes. That was very brave of you, Thomas, and very clever." Poirot looked at the boy seriously. "Now I'm going to ask you something, and I ask you to think very carefully. Did Croft ever mention the name Miss Voss before your mother mentioned it?" Thomas frowned. Then slowly, "Yes. Once. I was in the kitchen, and Croft was talking to the cook, Mrs. Henley. He said that when Miss Voss arrived, many things would change, but that was before Mum's announcement. I thought I'd misheard." Poirot stood up and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, a rare gesture for him, as he normally considered movement inefficient. "You didn't mishear. Now go to sleep, Thomas, and don't tell anyone we spoke. No one. Do you understand?" The boy understood, and he was 8 years old and clever enough to know when seriousness was appropriate. Alone in the drawing-room, Poirot blew the lamp lower and pondered. Croft knew Miss Voss even before Lady Ravenswood mentioned her name. A woman wept in the garden at night. Eleanor Voss vanished before she could arrive, and somewhere in this house lay a secret old enough to shape lives and perhaps end them. The little grey cells began to do their work. The butler's secret. Hercule Poirot didn't sleep well in strangers' houses. This wasn't a physical discomfort. The guest room at Ravenswood Manor was equipped with everything a comfortable night's sleep required. Soft pillows, a good woolen blanket, a small fire in the fireplace. No, it was the silence of the house that kept him awake, a silence that was too full, crammed with unspoken things. He lay on his back, his hands folded on his chest, letting the facts play out before his mind's eye. Orderly, precise, like pearls on a string. First, Croft knew Miss Voss's name before it was officially mentioned. Second, Lady Ravenswood claimed that Miss Voss had been recommended by a friend, Lady Ashbury, but had stated this fact with a suspicious hesitancy. Third, an unknown woman had visited the garden at night and spoken with Croft. Fourth, Sir Edmund Ravenswood had died 2 years earlier. The circumstances of his death were unknown. Fifth, Thomas did not sleep near the window because he saw something, or thought he saw something. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Poirot quietly got up, put on his dressing gown and crept down the corridor. He knew where he was going. The kitchen. The most honest people in a house were always found in kitchens. Mrs. Henley, the cook, was already awake. She was sitting at the kitchen island drinking tea, with the matter-of-factness of a woman accustomed to early mornings. She looked up when Poirot entered, but showed no exaggerated surprise. "I thought someone would come," she said. Her voice was like her body, round, solid, reliable. "Please sit down, monsieur. I'll make some fresh tea." Poirot sat down. He waited until the tea had been poured, and then asked casually, "You have been working for the family for a long time." 15 years, since Lady's wedding to Sir Edmund. Mrs. Henley held her cup with both hands. "I know this house inside and out, every creak in the floorboards, every draught in the fireplace." "And Croft?" The cook was silent for a moment. Then, "Croft came 3 years before me. He was Sir Edmund's personal servant before he became a butler. The two knew each other from the time before Sir Edmund married the lady." "A long loyalty," remarked Poirot. "Yes." But there was something in Mrs. Henley's tone that said more than the word itself. "Tell me, Mrs. Henley," continued Poirot, "who was the woman who was in the garden at night last week?" The cook put down her cup. She looked at him. In her eyes was a struggle, loyalty to the house against something else, against the need to be heard. The need won. "Her name was Dora Vane," Mrs. Henley said quietly. "She was the family's nanny 8 years ago before I came. She worked here, looking after the young children of another family who rented the manor. Then she disappeared. Nobody knew where. And now she's returned. She wanted to speak to Croft. I don't know what they wanted, but the next morning Croft was different, quieter than usual, and he was burning something in the study fireplace. Papers? It looked like it." Poirot drank his tea and thought. Then he asked the last question of the evening. "Mrs. Henley, how did Sir Edmund die?" The cook looked at him for a long time. "Officially, it was heart failure," she said. "He was 45 years old and in perfect health. That was the strange thing." "Yes," said Poirot quietly. "That is indeed strange." He returned to his room and sat by the fireplace for another hour without sleeping. The pieces began to fall into place, not yet completely, not yet clearly, but the outlines of a story were emerging, a darker and more terrifying than he had initially imagined. Miss Eleanor Voss had received the drawing. She had boarded the train nonetheless. And then, somewhere between London and Dunmoor, something had changed. Had she made the decision to disappear? Or had someone made that decision for her? And what did she know that was so dangerous that her mere presence in this house instilled fear? The past that did not die. The next morning, a Wednesday that began with the stark grey of an English November day, Hercule Poirot requested a meeting with Croft. He phrased the request with the utmost politeness, but in a tone that brooked no refusal. Lady Ravenswood, who had finished breakfast in silence, gave her consent with a brief nod without asking any questions. That too was revealing. Now Croft received him in the small servants' room behind the library, an unadorned space with an oval table and 4 chairs that looked as if they hadn't been used for years. He was already standing when Poirot entered, his hands behind his back, his face a mask of practised neutrality. But his eyes betrayed him, the eyes of a man who hadn't slept well. "Monsieur Poirot?" He waited until Poirot was seated before he sat down himself. "Croft," Poirot began without preamble, "I will tell you the truth before I ask any questions. I know that you know Miss Voss, not through the Ravenswood family. I know that Dora Vane was here last week and spoke with you, and I know that you burned papers the following morning." Not a muscle moved in Croft's face, and yet there was something there, not shock, more like relief. The strange relief of a man who's carried a weight for too long, and now sees that someone else sees it. "You're thorough, monsieur," he finally said. "I'm trying to be it. Now, would you like to tell me what I don't know?" Croft sat very still. Then he took a deep breath and began. He had known Miss Voss for 12 years. Not as a governess, as a daughter. Eleanor Voss was the illegitimate daughter of Sir Edmund Ravenswood, born before his marriage to Catherine, from a relationship with a London seamstress named Agnes Voss. Sir Edmund had never acknowledged the affair or the daughter, settling with Agnes Voss with a small sum of money and leaving the child to be forgotten. Agnes died 4 years later. Eleanor had grown up in an orphanage. Croft had known. He had known who Eleanor was from the very beginning. He had known Agnes Voss. He had witnessed the birth of little Eleanor. He had urged Sir Edmund at the time to acknowledge the child. Sir Edmund had refused. "And when Lady Ravenswood announced that she was hiring a governess named Miss Voss," asked Poirot, "I recognised the name immediately." Croft clasped his hands on the table. "At first I thought it was a coincidence, but then I wondered if Eleanor knew whose children she would be looking after, if she came here intentionally." "And Dora Vane?" Croft's eyes darkened slightly. Dora Vane was also once in Sir Edmund's service. She knew about Eleanor. She came to warn me. Eleanor had sought her out and told her everything. Dora told me Eleanor had discovered that Sir Edmund hadn't suffered heart failure. The sentence hung in the room like smoke. But what? Asked Poirot, although he suspected as much. Poisoned, said Croft. The word fell like a stone into still water. Eleanor had documents, old prescriptions, apothecary books, the records of a doctor Sir Edmund had consulted. Everything indicated that in the weeks before his death he had been regularly exposed to a substance, digitalis, in small doses administered over a long period. Who knew about this? Just Eleanor, and now me. Croft looked at Poirot. And you. Poirot nodded slowly. The papers you burned. Copies that Dora gave me. I wanted to protect them. Protect Eleanor. He lowered his head. But I'm afraid I did it wrong. It's not too late, Croft, said Poirot with a certainty he felt more than knew. But I need your help. Complete, unreserved help. Do you have any other information you've been withholding? The butler looked at him for a long time, then he nodded, and Poirot began to peel back the second layer of the riddle. Lady Ravenswood's confessional. There are moments in an investigation when everything converges on a single point, like rainwater on a drain. Hercule Poirot recognised such moments with the certainty of a man who had experienced them 100 times. After his conversation with Croft, he knew that this moment had now arrived. He asked Lady Ravenswood for a private conversation. This time no drawing room, no formality. He asked for her study, the room where Thomas had overheard the telephone conversation. She hesitated, but she agreed. The study was the most private room in the house. You sensed it immediately. It smelled of old paper and the faint perfume of a woman who rarely had enough time to remember she had even put it on. A dark mahogany desk, with on it a silver letter opener, an inkwell, a small framed mirror. No family photos. Lady Ravenswood sat down behind the desk. Poirot chose the chair opposite her. For a moment they looked at each other, two people who both knew that the conversation that would follow would change things. "My lady," began Poirot, "I will speak directly to you. I know the story of Miss Eleanor Voss. I know who she is. I know what she discovered, and I know that Sir Edmund Ravenswood may not have died a natural death." Lady Ravenswood did not move. Her face remained perfectly still, but her hands reached for the letter opener and held it tightly. "What do you want, Monsieur Poirot?" "The truth." She closed her eyes, kept them closed for a long moment. When she opened them again, something had changed. Not weakness, but exhaustion. The exhaustion of a woman who has fought for too long. "I knew about Eleanor," she said quietly. "I knew from the beginning. Edmund told me in the second week of our marriage. He thought it better for me to hear it from him rather than from someone else. I've accepted it. It's not easy, but you accept it." "And when you decided to hire a governess?" A long pause. "The name Voss had been recommended to me by Lady Ashbury. That's true. But when I received the references and saw the handwriting, Eleanor writes in a very peculiar left-leaning script, then I knew. I compared it to an old letter Edmund had shown me, a letter from Agnes Voss. They recognised their daughter. Yes. And yet you hired her?" Lady Ravenswood carefully placed the letter opener back on the table, as if she had to consciously force herself to let go. "I hired her because I wanted to be face-to-face with her, because I wanted to get to know her. I thought if she came here we could talk like adults. I wanted to tell her that Edmund had changed his will shortly before his death, that he had left her a small sum. I wanted to give her what she deserved." Poirot regarded her silently, then very calmly. "But she didn't come for money, my lady. She came because she believed she had evidence of something far more serious, of her father's murder." The silence that followed was so dense that one felt one could grasp it. "Murder," Lady Ravenswood repeated. The word seemed foreign to her, unreal. She thinks I murdered Edmund? Does she believe that?" "Monsieur Poirot, I didn't murder Edmund." Her voice was calm, too calm. The calm that comes after a long inner turmoil. "But I know who did it, and that's why I was glad she didn't arrive." Poirot leaned forward. "Tell me the name." Lady Ravenswood looked at him. In her eyes lay years of silence, of fear, of the loneliest kind of knowledge, the knowledge to which one is at the mercy of. "Croft," she said. The truth has two faces. Hercule Poirot used to say that every truth had at least two sides, like a coin that had to be turned to see both. At that moment in the study of Ravenswood Manor, he held such a coin in his hand, and both sides shimmered simultaneously. Croft had told him one version. Eleanor was in danger, and he wanted to protect her. Lady Ravenswood told him the other. Croft was the murderer, and Eleanor was a threat he wanted to eliminate. Who lied? Or were they both telling the truth at the same time? "Tell me about Edmund's death," said Poirot. "Everything. Leave nothing out." Lady Ravenswood began. Her voice was even, almost toneless, the voice of a woman who had gone over the story so often in her mind that the words were worn like old coins. Sir Edmund had changed in the months leading up to his death. Restless, suspicious, sleepless. He had begun secretly going through documents, hiding letters. He had grown cooler towards Croft, a coolness Catherine had noticed but hadn't been able to interpret. Then, one October evening 2 years ago, Sir Edmund had retired to his room after dinner, complained of nausea, and hadn't woken up the next morning. The doctor, Dr. Hewitt from the village, had diagnosed heart failure. No autopsy was requested. Edmund was 45. "Sometimes," said Dr. Hewitt, "men just die young." "Why do you think Croft was responsible for this?" asked Poirot. "Because Edmund said something to me in the last few weeks before he died." Lady Ravenswood clasped her hands in her lap. "He said he'd discovered Croft was stealing his money, systematically for years. Small amounts, well disguised, but undeniable. Edmund threatened to fire him. Worse, to report him. And you believe Croft poisoned him for that reason?" "I have no proof, only a certainty, an inner certainty. You know this, Monsieur Poirot. Sometimes you know things before you can prove them." Yes, thought Poirot, he knew that. "But you remained silent. I had children. I had no proof. And Croft acted completely normal after Edmund's death. Helpful, discreet, loyal, as if nothing had happened." She swallowed. That was the most unsettling thing. Poirot stood up and walked across the room, a rare sign of inner movement for him. Then he stopped. "My lady, I will give you my assessment, and I ask you to listen to it carefully. Croft told me a story this morning that contradicts yours. He claimed Eleanor had proof against the true murderer, and that he wanted to protect her. Now you tell me he is the murderer himself. Is cool. Perhaps, or he's saying what he believes." Poirot turned around. "Because there is a third possibility, my lady, one you haven't considered. What if Croft also believes Sir Edmund to be murdered, and suspects someone else?" Lady Ravenswood looked at him. Something stirred in her eyes. "Who?" she asked. But her voice didn't sound entirely confident. Poirot didn't answer immediately. He thought of the locked doors, of the letters with the red bird seal, of the words Thomas had overheard. "She knows too much." "That," he said slowly, "is the question we must answer, before Miss Voss is found, before further damage is done." He said goodbye and left the study. In the corridor, he took out his notebook and wrote 3 words. Who protects whom? The woman in the red seal. Poirot needed information from London. He asked Lady Ravenswood for permission to use her telephone and spoke for 20 minutes with his reliable friend at Scotland Yard, Inspector Japp, who, with the gruff efficiency of seasoned police officers, took 3 requests at once: the death file of Sir Edmund Ravenswood, background information on a certain Dora Vane, and a current whereabouts for Miss Eleanor Voss. While he waited, he did what he always did when the facts were still too thin for conclusions. He observed people. Cecily Ravenswood, his 7-year-old daughter, sat in the library after breakfast, leafing through a large picture book. But her gaze didn't follow the pictures. It stared into the distance, into the middle distance, with the peculiar absent-mindedness of children who think too much. Poirot sat down next to her. "What kind of book is this?" he asked. Cecily looked up. "Natural history. About birds." "Are you interested in birds?" She showed him a page, a robin. "That's Dad's favourite bird," she said. Then, after a pause, "Was." Poirot nodded gently. "Did you love your father very much?" "He used to read me a story every morning," said Cecily. "I still remember how he smelled, of tobacco and lavender." She swallowed. "Thomas says he's still here, in the house, but I don't believe it." "What do you think?" The child looked at him with a seriousness that moved him. "I think he's gone." but I believe that someone knows why he's gone and that this person is still here." Poirot was silent for a moment. Then he asked, "Cecily, have you ever seen a letter with a red bird on it? A small seal?" The child hesitated, then very quietly, "Mommy sometimes gets letters like that. I saw one on the desk once. She immediately took it away and locked it away. Do you know who they came from? No. But Thomas says that once a letter with the same seal was in Papa's study, before he died." Poirot thanked them with the smile of a man who has received a gift. Then he returned to the telephone room, where Japp was already waiting for him. The information Japp provided was revealing. Sir Edmund's death file contained no indication of poisoning. Dora Vane, no criminal record, last known residence London Whitechapel, worked as a seamstress. Miss Eleanor Voss, a railway surveillance camera in Swindon, recorded her at 5:43 p.m. Getting off the train to Bristol. She hadn't disappeared. She had rerouted. But the most important point was the last one. The red bird seal belonged to a person named Mr. Archibald Greer, a London lawyer specialising in inheritance matters. And Greer had worked as Sir Edmund Ravenswood's personal lawyer until 3 years prior. Poirot put the receiver down and went to the window. The fog had grown even thicker. Somewhere in that damp, grey English October, Eleanor Voss was sitting on a train to Bristol, believing herself to be safe. But she had overlooked something in her escape, or rather someone she had overlooked, but who hadn't overlooked her. Poirot called Japp again. "I urgently need a connection to Bristol, and I need Mr. Archibald Greer's address in London." "What have you discovered, Poirot?" "Not enough yet, but I'm beginning to understand why a woman would get on a train she knew she wouldn't be able to finish." The Governess speaks. Eleanor Voss was in a small boarding-house room in Bristol when Poirot's telegram reached her. The room was sparsely furnished. A bed, a chair, a washstand with a mirror in which the light from the gas lamp refracted yellow. She sat on the bed, holding the telegram with both hands like someone holding a stone to keep it from flying away. "I know your name and your story. I am working on the truth. Please call this number, H. Poirot," she called. Poirot answered after the second ring, and her first reaction to his voice was silence, the silence of a woman who doesn't know whether to cry or speak. Then she spoke. Eleanor Voss was 33 years old and had spent most of that time observing the world from a position of invisibility. The governess, the helper, the woman who raised other people's children and whose own story didn't matter, until 6 months ago. Then she received a letter from a lawyer whose name she didn't know, Archibald Greer. He wrote that he had documents in his possession that might be of interest to her. Documents concerning her father. She knew who her father was. She always had. Her mother had told her everything on her deathbed, with the quiet exhaustion of a woman who could bear no more secrets. At dusk, Sir Edmund Ravenswood, married, wealthy, uninterested. Greer had received her in his office, a refined room in Mayfair crammed with the books. He had shown her the documents. First, an amended will that Sir Edmund had drawn up shortly before his death, in which Eleanor was left £3,000. Second, a handwritten memo from Sir Edmund himself, noting discrepancies in the household accounts. Third, a report from a private detective whom Sir Edmund had hired a few weeks before his death. The report described observations made around the Ravenswood estate. It noted regular clandestine visits from a person Sir Edmund referred to as Mrs. X. The final entry in the report, dated 4 days before Sir Edmund's death, contained the following line: "Identified the person. Awaiting your instructions. After that, nothing more." Again, the detective had not submitted any further reports. "And Greer?" asked Poirot. "Where did he get these documents?" "He told me Sir Edmund left them with him, in case something happened to him." Eleanor paused briefly. "He was afraid, Monsieur Poirot. My father was afraid before he died, and he entrusted his life to these documents." "Do you still have the documents?" "Yes, I have copies. Greer gave me copies shortly before." She broke off. "Just before what?" "Shortly before someone broke into his office, 4 weeks ago. Greer was unharmed, but the original documents were stolen." Now it was Poirot's turn to remain silent. Then, "Miss Voss, I'm going to ask you a direct question. Who is Mrs. X?" A long pause. He could hear her breathing on the phone. "I think I know," she finally said, "but I'm not sure. And that's why I wanted to come to Ravenswood. Not to demand money, not to take revenge, but to look her in the eye and know if my suspicions were correct. Who did you want to look into the eyes of? And she gave the name. Poirot listened. When she had finished, he thanked her, asked her to stay in Bristol, and to return to London in 2 days, where they would meet in Japp's presence. He would arrange everything. As he hung up, he sat very still in the telephone room of Ravenswood Manor, staring at the wall in front of him. The truth had been revealed, not what he had expected, not what anyone in this house had expected. Sir Edmund Ravenswood's murderer was neither Croft nor Lady Ravenswood. It was someone no one would ever have suspected of evil. What slept in the locked rooms? Evidence requires not only logic, then it requires courage. The courage to think a conclusion through to its logical conclusion, even if it hurts. Hercule Poirot always possessed this courage. It was precisely this courage that sometimes made him hated by people who preferred to live in comfortable ambiguity. He asked Lady Ravenswood to open the locked rooms. This time she hesitated longer. But he didn't ask twice. He simply waited, with the quiet persistence of a man who knows he will eventually get what he needs. The first locked room was Sir Edmund's bedroom, unchanged since his death, like a museum of silence. Poirot passed through it without touching much. He saw what he needed to see. On the bedside table, a small flask, empty, without a label. He carefully placed it in his coat pocket. The second locked room was a kind of sewing room with an old wardrobe, a dressing table and a half-finished embroidery frame. Everything was thick with dust. Poirot paused by the dressing table. Under the glass, carefully framed like a treasure, lay a small photograph. A woman with a baby. On the back, Agnes, 1901. Agnes Voss, Eleanor's mother. What was this photograph doing in Ravenswood Manor? The third room was empty, completely empty, with freshly painted walls, as if the room had recently been renovated. But in the corner, where the flooring was new and a slightly different colour, Poirot knelt down and ran his finger along the seam. Someone had torn up the floor here and laid a new one. The fourth room was Croft's chamber. Poirot knocked. Croft opened the door immediately. He had been waiting, that much was clear. His face bore the expression of a man who had made a decision. "I know why you've come," he said. "Come in." The room was tidy, almost Spartan. There was an envelope on the small desk. Croft slid it towards Poirot. "I didn't burn it," he said. "I lied. I wanted to buy time to decide what was right." The envelope contained 2 documents. The first was a transcript from Sir Edmund's diary, written during the last 3 weeks of his life. The entries became increasingly fragmentary, filled with anxiety. He wrote of mistrust, of conversations he had overheard, of a truth he could not grasp. The second document was a handwritten note, short, undated, 6 sentences. Poirot read it, twice. Then he folded the paper and put it back. "Who gave you this document?" he asked. "Dora Vane, the night she was in the garden." Croft looked at his hands. She'd gotten it from Sir Edmund, and he'd given it to her as insurance, in case something happened to him. Poirot stood up. The truth lay before him now, clear and painful like a fresh cut. He only had to prove it, and then he would have to fulfill the most difficult task a detective knows, to reveal to someone that the evil had not come from a stranger, but from within. "Croft," he said, "there's one more thing I need to ask you. In that empty room, the third one, the floor has been relaid. Do you know why?" The butler swallowed. "Yes," he said, "I know." "Good." Poirot stood up. "Tomorrow morning we will bring everything to light. Everything. In the drawing room. I ask you to be ready." The unveiling. Hercule Poirot didn't perform any theatrical revelations. That was the prerogative of bad novels. What he did was something both simpler and more difficult. He created the conditions under which the truth revealed itself. On Wednesday morning, all those involved gathered in the grand drawing room of Ravenswood Manor. Lady Ravenswood sat on the Chesterfield sofa, her hands folded, her face masked. Croft stood near the door. Mrs. Henley, whom Poirot had expressly requested to be present, sat on a straight chair at the side of the room. Inspector Japp, who had arrived early in the morning in response to Poirot's telegram, stood discreetly by the fireplace, and Eleanor Voss, the governess who had never arrived, sat on a high chair in the middle of the room. She had spent the night at the village inn, having returned at Poirot's invitation. She was shorter than Poirot had imagined, with the calm, withdrawn face of a woman who knew pain and managed it. Her gaze met Lady Ravenswood for a long moment, two women who had loved the same man, each in her own painful way. Poirot spoke without a preamble. Sir Edmund Ravenswood died of heart failure in October 2 years ago. That was the official diagnosis. The truth is more complicated, as the truth in this house is always more complicated than what is visible on the surface. He began with the facts. In the weeks leading up to his death, Sir Edmund had discovered irregularities, not in the household accounts, but in his own will. Someone had forged it, not to give Eleanor something, but to take something away from her. The original will, which Sir Edmund had drawn up shortly before the forged one, named Eleanor as the principal heir to a small estate in Scotland, which Sir Edmund had inherited from his father, separate from Ravenswood, separate from the family. "Who forged the will?" asked Japp. "The lawyer who drew it up was a certain Percival Morton. Morton had been corrupted by money. He was paid to destroy the original and draw up a version in which the Scottish estate passed to the main line of the Ravenswoods. But Sir Edmund noticed the change. He secretly sent the documents to Greer and hired the private detective." "And then he was poisoned," said Lady Ravenswood softly. "Poisoned," confirmed Poirot. "The empty flask in his bedroom contained traces of a digitalis tincture. In small doses administered over weeks, it is fatal for a man with an existing undiagnosed heart arrhythmia. The private detective had identified Mrs. X, the person who had been paying regular clandestine visits. He was waiting for Edmund's instructions. Edmund died before he could give them." "Who is Mrs. X?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was perfectly calm. Poirot turned to her. "You already know Miss Voss. You told me her name on the phone." "I want her to say it herself." Silence. Then, from the chair next to the library door, a figure rose who had barely been noticed until then. An older woman whom Poirot had introduced shortly before the meeting began, supposedly as a witness. Dora Vane. "You must say it," Poirot said to her, gently but firmly. Dora Vane was 60 years old, with the face of a woman who had more decades behind her than ahead of her. She looked at Lady Ravenswood. Lady Ravenswood looked back. "It was your sister," said Dora Vane. "Margaret. Sir Edmund's first fiancée before he married Catherine. Margaret Ashbury. Now married Greystone. She wanted the estate, the Scottish estate. She thought it was hers. She pressured Edmund, threatened him, and when he stood his ground—" "Did she kill him?" Poirot finished. Lady Ravenswood closed her eyes. Lady Ashbury, her friend, who had recommended Miss Voss to her. Her friend, who had deliberately sent Miss Voss to her house to check whether the documents had surfaced yet, to stay close to the action. "Margaret," she whispered. "My God." Japp had already pulled out his notepad. The end of silence. The arrest of Margaret Greystone, née Ashbury, took place 3 days later at her country house in Somerset, by Inspector Japp himself, in the presence of 2 constables and Hercule Poirot, who exceptionally had watched without intervening. Margaret Greystone was 62 years old. She wore a perfectly pressed tweed suit, and had the bearing of a woman who would never feel guilty, which in a way worried Poirot more than a confession. She denied everything. Of course. But the evidence, carefully gathered over months and reconstructed by Greer's office, was overwhelming. The corrupt lawyer Morton, who broke under the pressure of Japp's interrogations within 6 hours. The apothecary books, which documented a regular order of small quantities of digitalis preparations under a false name, a name undoubtedly recorded in Margaret's handwriting, and finally the note that Dora Vane had kept. Sir Edmund's last desperate attempt to record the truth. 6 words in shaky ink. "Margaret was here. I am afraid." In the days following the arrest, Ravenswood Manor breathed like a creature long submerged, finally reaching the surface. The window stood open, even though it was November. Mrs. Henley baked bread for the first time in months. Thomas slept in his room again, near the window, and saw nothing at night but the stars. Eleanor Voss and Lady Ravenswood were talking. It wasn't a simple conversation. How could it be between 2 women who were both victims of the same man, albeit in different ways? But it was an honest one. Poirot didn't learn the details, nor had he sought them out. Some conversations belong only to the people who have them. What he did know was that Eleanor would receive the Scottish estate as soon as the forged will was declared invalid, that she intended to sell it and use the money to educate poor children, that Lady Ravenswood would write her a letter that week, revealing what she could never say aloud. Croft asked to be dismissed. Poirot hadn't expected it, but he understood. The butler had known too much and done too little for too long, not out of malice, but out of the human, tragic inability to act when action demands too much. Lady Ravenswood let him go with a generous severance package and without bitterness. On his last evening at Ravenswood Manor, Poirot sat alone in the grand drawing-room, drinking his herbal tea. The fire was burning. The silence was different from the beginning, not heavy, but soft. The silence of rooms that had finally been tidied up. Thomas appeared in the doorway, this time walking with the permitted gait in his proper pyjamas and without the worn-out bear. "You're leaving tomorrow?" "Yes." "Have you found out what happened to Miss Voss?" "Miss Voss is safe," said Poirot. "She was always safe. She had the wisdom to get off a dangerous train before it arrived at the wrong place." Thomas thought for a moment. "Like a migratory bird," he said. "It realizes it's flying in the wrong direction and turns around." Poirot looked at the boy. "Exactly like that, Thomas. Like a clever migratory bird." The boy nodded and disappeared again. Poirot drank his tea and looked at the fire. Later, while packing, the child's drawing fell out of his coat pocket. He looked at it again. A house, a tree, 2 small figures holding hands. "Don't come, please." He had read it as a warning, and that's what it was. But now he saw something else in it. Not just a warning, but an invitation. The plea of a child who wished that the world outside his house would remain safe. He carefully put the drawing back in his pocket. He wouldn't throw it away. Some documents in a case deserve to be preserved, not as evidence but as memories, as reminders of why the work he did was important, not the ingenuity, not the fame, not the little grey cells, however indispensable they may have been, but this, a child who warns a stranger, a woman who gets off a train because she is stronger than her fear, a butler who remains silent for too long and then does the right thing, a mother who learns that truth is more painful and necessary than protection. Ravenswood Manor had had 3 secrets. Now it had none. The next morning, Hercule Poirot boarded a train to London. This time, all the seats were occupied. Epilogue. There are no perfect cases. There are only complete truths, and how people learn to live with them. Margaret Greystone was sentenced to 12 years in prison, of which she served 7. She showed no remorse at her trial. Percival Morton, the fake lawyer, received 5 years. He wrote Poirot a long letter from prison, asking that his story serve as a warning. Poirot did not reply. Eleanor Voss sold the Scottish estate and founded a small school in London for underprivileged children. She didn't name it after anyone. She called it the Migratory Bird School. Poirot sent her a donation every Christmas. Lady Catherine Ravenswood remained at the manor. Over time, the rooms were opened up, the windows more frequently. She didn't adopt new friendships lightly, but those she did make lasted. Thomas Ravenswood became a botanist. Cecily, a painter. They say she's good. Croft moved to Edinburgh and worked as an accountant in a small hotel. He was, by all accounts, very precise. And Hercule Poirot returned to his London apartment, arranged his papers, made himself some herbal tea and played his game of solitaire. On the small table by the window, neatly framed, lay a child's drawing. A house, a tree, 2 figures holding hands. He looked at her every morning, and every morning he remembered why the truth, however painful, was always better than the silence with which secrets are guarded. The governess who never arrived had ultimately brought the most important thing, the end of a long, lonely lie, and that, thought Hercule Poirot, was enough. End.